Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons, and specifically how Dungeons & Dragons is a vector. So this is a supposition that I am putting forward, that Dungeons & Dragons is a vector. Okay, all right, so let's talk about it. What is a vector? Okay, so a vector is a quantity with direction and magnitude used to show a point in space relative to another point. Okay, that's a vector, right? Now, why am I saying Dungeons & Dragons is a vector? Why am I making this supposition that Dungeons & Dragons is a vector? Well, the reason why I'm saying that is because of the word game, all right? So I have to make a confession. Whenever I hear the word game used to describe Dungeons & Dragons, my fur just stands on end like a cat, you know, like when a cat's disturbed or alert, you know, like it really rankles me to hear Dungeons & Dragons described as a game, right? Also, of course, it really kind of gets my fur up when I hear it's just a game, right? And the reason why is I just really fundamentally believe this is wrong, right? And so I want to talk about this term, thinking about Dungeons & Dragons as a vector, right? So what is it a vector for? Well, actually, before we go for that, I want to talk about the word game. So why does it disturb me when the word game is used to describe Dungeons & Dragons? Well, the reality is I feel like the word is just way too small to contain the concept of Dungeons & Dragons, right? And the reality is, you know, I really feel that Dungeons & Dragons is shaping the word game. The word game does not shape Dungeons & Dragons, right? So let's talk about why I think that. So I've been thinking, you know, I have a degree in political science. I think a lot about politics. I'm kind of a wonk on that area. I love politics. I follow it the way most people follow football. And I've been thinking a lot about Abraham Lincoln lately, right? And so if you went to somebody and you said, who was Abraham Lincoln? And they said, well, Abraham Lincoln was a speaker. They would be 100% correct in saying that Abraham Lincoln was a speaker. He absolutely was a speaker, right? That is 100% true, right? But the reality is that word speaker is too small to contain what Abraham Lincoln was. I think a better word is to say he was a president, right? And, you know, because that just gives you a better sense of what he achieved, what position he held, why he was important, all those kind of things, right? He was a speaker, but more importantly than that, I think he was a president, right? And he was a president, I would actually say he was a crisis president. He was a president during a moment of crisis in our nation, right? And so when I think about Dungeons & Dragons, it's the same thing. It is a, game. Saying Dungeons & Dragons is a game is 100% correct. It is a game, right? But people who refer to it as a game aren't understanding the full scope of what Dungeons & Dragons is, was, and will be, right? That's my issue, right? But the word vector, I think, properly conveys what Dungeons & Dragons actually is, all right? So if it's a vector, what is it carrying? Vectors carry something, okay? And I think Dungeons & Dragons is a vector, and it carries three things. Dungeons & Dragons carries art, it carries social, and it carries game. All right, so it is a vector for art. It is a vector for social. It is a vector for game, all right? So let's talk about it, all right? How is it a vector for art? Okay, so basically, art existed before Dungeons & Dragons, art exists during Dungeons & Dragons, and art will exist as Dungeons & Dragons goes forward with art into the future, right? And the reality is Dungeons & Dragons is a vector for art. I believe Dungeons & Dragons is changing art, right? So one of the ideas is there is something that is happening with art that happens within Dungeons & Dragons that did not happen prior to Dungeons & Dragons, and that is shared art, right? So art being created by a group of people, right? Now, there certainly is precedence for what Dungeons & Dragons is doing. Plays are similar, right? Plays are similar Plays do a similar thing to art that Dungeons & Dragons is doing to art, right? But in my opinion, Dungeons & Dragons is purely better than plays, right? And the reason why is Dungeons & Dragons can iterate faster. It can iterate faster. And maybe better is not the right word, but I think D&D is just more relevant for our times. Speed is king in our world. If you can iterate quickly, that is incredibly important. It is just so important. And we can iterate telling stories with Dungeons & Dragons, and we can create this shared art in a way that no other platform has allowed, right? So Dungeons & Dragons is a vector for art, okay? All right. Dungeons & Dragons is a vector for social, right? So what is Dungeons & Dragons doing to social that is different than what has been done before Dungeons & Dragons? Well, it's how human beings socially interact with imagination, right? So it is, at the macro level, Dungeons & Dragons is 5 people interacting with their imaginations communally, right? Trying to see the same thing, often failing, and those permutations, those parameters that are being stretched by the imaginatory progression of a Dungeons & Dragons game is where the magic happens. It's where, the social aspects of our humanity are changed slightly, and where social interaction is changed, right? And I think that Dungeons & Dragons is just showing a really unique way that people can interact in a social way around the element of imagination, right? So basically you are dealing with social interaction with imagination, and Dungeons & Dragons does that in a way that no other platform has ever accomplished, okay? And then finally, it is absolutely a vector for game, right? So how is Dungeons & Dragons carrying the concept of game forward and changing the concept of game? Well, I think one of the biggest ways is Dungeons & Dragons is a lossless game. There is no losing in Dungeons & Dragons. You cannot lose a Dungeons & Dragons game, right? Now, I absolutely think you could win a Dungeons & Dragons game. You win a Dungeons & Dragons game when every single person at the table is winning, right? Everyone there has to win together, right? And but the idea of a game that has no loss, that has no loser, right? That defies the parameters of win-lose, right? That, again, Dungeons & Dragons is doing something that really has never been done before to the concept of game, right? So when somebody says, what is Dungeons & Dragons, right? I get, for a lot of reasons, that many companies and many groups and many people are going to say Dungeons & Dragons is a game, right? But the reality is, J. Scott Garibay, I think that Dungeons & Dragons is a vector, and that the word game is like applying the word game to Dungeons & Dragons is like taking an ocean and trying to put it into a cup. Game is not large enough to contain what Dungeons & Dragons is. Dungeons & Dragons is a vector. It is a quantity with direction and magnitude. And it is showing a point in space for art, for social, and for game relative to another point in space, right? It is showing us where we were with art, with social, and with game 44 years ago, and where we are now with art, social, and game, and where we will be in the future with art, social, and game. And I really feel that Dungeons & Dragons is so large and so wonderful and so special that it morphs those words. It stretches those words. It itself is not stretched by them, right? It is just a pure force. It's just such a hugely pure force. We want to make sure it's used for good, but it's just, you know, I really feel that the appropriate word for Dungeons and Dragons is not game, it is vector, right? And it's just really important to understand that, you know, that connection between those two things, because it allows, and I think it's especially important for a dungeon master, right? And specifically for a skilled veteran dungeon master to see the game in this way, to recognize the game for what it is, right? In my opinion, what it is. I certainly understand that Dungeons and Dragons is a special thing. It's owned by many people. At the more open, of course, it's currently owned by Hasbro and WotC, but as a community, we own some of its aspects. You know, some of its more ethereal aspects, right? I think that might be a better way to put it. When I say ownership, you know, I mean just, and maybe just fandom is a better word. But the reality is, I really feel that the appropriate term for Dungeons and Dragons is vector, right? It's large enough, that word is large enough to contain what Dungeons and Dragons is. I'm curious what you guys think. What do you think is the appropriate word to accurately, fully describe, or more fully describe Dungeons and Dragons? And, you know, please let me know below in the comments. And thank you very much for watching today. And please consider liking and subscribing. Take care.